been a wonderful afternoon, and what a way to kind of close it out with some good interaction, some good discussion. Um, we'll just now do a very informal question and answers for the next half hour, and after that, I'd like to just, after we get done with that, I'll introduce Dr. Patricia Keeley, because I'd like for her to speak about the wonderful things that she's been doing with community engagement, and specifically with study abroad that draws in not just the students but the wider community, called Community on the Go. And in terms of a kind of integrative systems approach, this is really that in practice, involving the community with the university to develop that kind of empathy that I was talking about, certainly going to come out of that building professional and personal bonds and relationships. This is the ideal thing that universities need to do to make themselves not only relevant in the community, but be seen as relevant in the community. So she's doing some really excellent work in that area, and I'd really appreciate if she'd, at the end of this, come up and share a few of her ideas and comments and the stuff that she's doing, because it's really spectacular stuff. Okay, so when you ask your questions, because we don't have a mic to pass around, I appreciate if you would project your voice. The boom mic is very sensitive, it should pick you up. And then what I'll do is, as well as repeat the question, and then I will pass around the mic with the panel here to give the answers. So let's just open it up. Did you like what you heard here today? Did you? Yes. May I? Yes, please. Oh.
So my staff will laugh at me, but they found a note from an intern a few years ago that was like, if you want to make Bridget happy, have a plan. So my question for you all is, like, where do plans fit within integrative systems?
So the question is, where do plans fit in an integrative system? So that's actually a really good question. And should I take it? Or you take it? Go ahead.
And I should say that, like, for me, the purpose of the plan is to get the goals and the North Star really clear in people's minds. It's not so much the processes and the objectives that go with it, but just that everybody is in agreement to that's where we're going.
Right. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Dr. Steve Ott from the University of Utah, who co-taught this course with us in the Deming Institute. Of course, you know Heather Groom, Ravi, Roy, Kevin Cahill, and Bill Bellows. So just address. Did you want to take that question? Should I take that question?
Well, let's go back to what you mean by a plan to start with. And you started refining it. I, by the way, don't like to use strategic planning anymore, because that's become such a buzzword it doesn't have any meaning, that every time now we're going to plan out next week, it's a strategic plan. Okay. But back to the plan. I think it's just like, as was mentioned with the management by objectives. Start with where we're trying to get, and start with what the relationships are in between, and then work backwards toward the plan. If you start with a plan, you start forcing people into roles. Also, to your question, a much larger issue. There's quite a bit of research that the biggest changes in public administration, and by that I mean both government and nonprofit and the relationship among, over the last decade has been the movement to partnerships, okay, interagency, back to Bryson Crosby and chaos theory and all of this. And who was it that mentioned wicked problems? I think you did. There is no agency, there is no nonprofit that has the authority and the resources to solve wicked problems or serious problems. So how do you put a plan together for something like that? Especially when the partnership is imposed by a funding agency. Okay, so the plan for me is about step 5, particularly when it's interagency, particularly when it's intersectoral. But I could go on, but I think I'll let somebody else take off.
The thing that jumps out at me about plans is the fact that when we talk to different organizations is they have lots and lots of plans. But the reality is, have they really thought about by what realistic method can I achieve those plans? And looking at that ends up making the plan become more of a powerful mechanism to actually accomplish something. Because scattered throughout my grandfather's book, The New Economics, he'll talk about goals and plans. America 2000 was some education project that was 15 years before. But it sounded great, sounded like a terrific plan, but there was no method by which to achieve it. And I think that's the big thing is, if we put the plan into play and it's bound to fail, then all we've done is look at, well, everybody's realizing, well, that plan's really not going to work. Let's just wait for that to run its course so we can come up with a new plan. And then you're kind of on that treadmill of just putting plan after plan after plan without realizing, well, why is it really failing? Is the method by which to do it, is this plan really achievable? And if it was, why wasn't it done before?
Or is it so micro?
Yep.
That it's trivial?
Yeah. Is that?
So, in the Alice in Wonderland, I tell this to the students, there's a line that said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there, right? But oftentimes, we don't know where we're going. We think we know where we're going, but we don't actually know where we're going. We don't know what the outcome is, or at least we think we know what the outcome is, and so that makes it hard. But as Steve was talking about, referring to backward mapping, start also to understand the problem, where the problem actually is. We saw in 1973 with Pressman and Wadowski's book and their analysis of how Great Expectations made in Washington failed right there in the docklands of Oakland, right? How they failed in Oakland, right? Because the planners sitting there in D.C. did not understand how the local unions operated in Oakland in an urban renewal project. They didn't understand the interests of the local politicians. They didn't understand the planning procedures, right? But they attempted to design a top-down approach that reflected, first of all, two things. First of all, the goals of the Washington elites at the top, number one. Does that sound familiar? But number two, also, the values of the central planners, which were largely based on economic rationality of the one best way, right? And what Deming has tried to do is shake us up is, that's not, the best practices in the one best way, that's not going to lead to innovation. That already assumes that you come to a definitive thing of this is what it is for that context, when in fact, the environments in which we're operating, the contexts are dynamic and shifting. And this is particularly true in case of network governance and open-ended agencies. So really we first of all have to, if you're going to talk about planning, first of all make sure that you're demonstrating fidelity when you design the plan, that it is actually consistent with the objectives and that those objectives actually have buy-in for them. So first, before you plan, I think you need first of all to build an organic, basic consensus about where you want to go, and then think backwards, as Steve said. I'll just add to that.
Yeah. Now, Ravi's answer just reminded me of the difference between a me organization and a we organization. Both have plans. The Japanese, well, Dr. Deming talked about PDSA, Plan, Do, Study, Act. And it's not uncommon in Japan, they talk PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. I think the PDCA fits a me organization where there's a plan to implement, and by golly, we're going to make it happen. And so what came to mind is I had students years ago in this Deming class, keep a journal and write about, they had them write some stories. And the one story that comes up that fits, they had one guy worked for a company that had a plan to put in place a overnight shipping facility for one of the biggest overnight shipping facilities. So this is either UPS or FedEx, one of those. And they were going to build a facility to ship 1.5 million packages a day. And when they got it up and running, it only shipped 1 million a day. So instead of stepping back and saying what's wrong with our theory, why does this not work? It worked elsewhere. They made it work. And when the student told me about it, you just can't make this up. He said the packages came in, and they would come down a conveyor belt, and an operator would read the city and state in the package, and that would direct the package to the appropriate airplane. That was the sorting system. Well, they got it up and running, and it only shipped 1 million a day, but if they increased the speed of the conveyor belt, they could ship 1.5 million. So he did. I said, so what happens? He says, well, and I said, wait, let me guess. I said, the operator can't read that fast. He said, well, the operator can talk that fast, but he can't read that fast. I said, so tell me what happens. He said they shipped 1.5 million packages a day by having this guy recite cities and states as fast as they could, but they weren't the cities and states on the packages. So in a me organization, PD, check, it's not working, well then, damn it, make it work, as opposed to stepping back and saying, what is the theory by which this should have worked? I mean, we designed factories based on some theory. Maybe there's something wrong with our theory. So in a we organization, we step back and say, what's wrong with our theory? In a me organization, we increase the speed of the conveyor belt. And so when I asked him, I said, do you lose any packages? He says, no. But a third of them come through here twice, and we know exactly where they are. And then, then I asked him, I said, so do the people upstairs ask how many packages come through here twice? He says, no, we don't tell them either. So never underestimate. And so back to your point, the plan will be accomplished in a me organization, but don't ask by what method. And it just becomes scary. They'll get it done.
Yes.
I had a question. I was talking to Heather earlier. She suggested I ask this question of the panel. So it's all your fault, Heather.
Uh-oh.
So I am on the town council in a very small town. We only have 3 employees in the town. And so when you come into, and they're kind of organized along a we organization. There's one room, there's 3 desks where the 3 people work. And they do like that because when there's an issue, they all 3 sit there and they talk about it and they work out how they want to resolve the problem. And so that's all good. But what happens is when the public comes in, they're right there in that room. There's all the desks. Everybody stops working. They all talk to the member of the public, and they'll sit there for 30 minutes having a conversation with the public. How's your wife? How's your kids? How's this? How's that? I got a new car. How's your house? What's this? And 30 minutes, they get no work done. And then that person leaves, and the next person comes in. So by the end of the day, they've really achieved very little work. And so the only thing I can come up with is to put them in individual offices and shut the door so that they don't interact with the public, so they get their work done. But then that's a me organization. But how can they be a we organization and still get their work done because of the public? So, any suggestions?
So let me see if I can frame this in a sentence. So how do you keep people focused on their work if when they're interacting with people, they're not interacting over business but over social? And so the solution that you came up with is to separate them, but is there a better way?
Because what?
Is there a better way than just to separate them and keep?
What is the possible solution? He's like, no.
You're supposed to sit next to me so I can hand you the mic. Well, one of the things that jumps out at me with respect to that is if those 3 people have a full and complete understanding of what the organization is trying to accomplish, okay? I mean, if they can actually recite that, I mean, they understand the aim, and then it's very clear, it's made visible by what method, again, going back to that, are we going to achieve this aim? The realization may come out that, wait a second, we can't achieve what we need to do if all 3 of us are talking to that same person. And that them coming to that realization oftentimes may be better than it being imposed on them without that understanding. Well, we have fun talking to those people. I mean, there may be great value in that interaction. So it's not that you necessarily would, I would offer that you might not necessarily want to end that interaction, but maybe that they come to the realization that, hey, well, why don't we take turns, for example, talking? Or I know somebody and I'll be the one talking to them and the other two of us will, go back to work. So maybe it can be set up that way. Again, my thinking is that if you take that away from the actual, obviously a very small area, that interaction could be critical in terms of how the community functions together, what's going on, what you need to know. So you don't necessarily, you may not, I don't know enough about it, that you may not necessarily want to lose that interaction, but have them come up with the ideas on how we might be able to better function as a system. And then making that visible. So you're putting it on a piece of paper, and you're saying, let's see what happens. And then all of a sudden you see those lines going out, and they look at it and they may say, well, wait a second, all three of us. So what does that mean to the rest of our work? Does that mean we have to stay late? Does that mean we have to come on the weekends? Does that mean it doesn't get done? And any of those may have an impact on their family, their social situation, the work of the town. And so I always feel that getting them to come to that realization has the greatest power. Now he's ready.
No, one thing that comes to mind is sometimes separate is better. That's what I learned from working with ACOF. I mean, people who study systems think it's always better to have things connected than not. And then I don't know where it was, probably an airport, walked in, and the mirror was on one wall, not behind the sink. And I thought, what a great idea. By separating them, the people who want to wash their hands and get through can do that. And that's what I think is sometimes the best way to manage systems is to separate them. And and also the other thing I was thinking of in your story is years ago we had this improvement team. We were meeting every day, and then somebody had the idea to invite the machinists who didn't like anything that we were doing to our meetings. And then it turned into a 1-hour bitch session. And I said, well, now we have to have another meeting without those people in the room. So, and I kidded the one guy. I said, because all these guys want to hear is, yes, I know, yes, I know. I said, the rest of us don't have to be here. So you hold the meeting and you keep saying, yes, I know. And that's what I hear you saying is, you need to separate. I mean, you want to be able to hear what the issue is, but then somehow separate it from the work getting done.
A lot of times they'll come up with the idea themselves.
Yeah, I would start back to Kevin's point, that the first step should be a conversation with the staff people. In fact, probably a series of conversations with the staff people about what's involved. Then it goes back, the easiest thing to say is to separate them. But I think, one of the biggest problems we're facing in our country today is alienation between government and the public. And if you were to cut in a small town that kind of communication off, the side consequences may be worse than the solution. But I did have one thought, and it's just off a wall. Suppose you had visible barriers. In other words, you could not get eyesight from the person in the public to all three, only the person they're interacting with. Then the staff could still talk things over, but there would not be that snubbing of the public. But again, preserving the relationship between government and those served is very, very difficult these days.
Yes, and that's why I didn't want to block that off. It's just, they do
But I
have to work
think
on
you-
weekends and at nights to try to.
But I think you could limit it by visual barriers, except the person serving, who could still have side conversations.
Well, and one last thought. you know, and this happened to me a few years ago, whenever you get in one of those situations where it's like, okay, this is what we don't want this. And what I've realized, and it takes more work, is to actually sit down and think, what do you want? And really articulate it and say, as part of kind of moving forward, saying, okay, I want them to interact with the public, but I want them to meet their deadlines. I want them, you know, but really spell those things out, because it's really easy for all of us to complain or find these things wrong. But when you say, okay, but what is it that I want, or what is it that I'm trying to do, and turn that mindset a little bit, then it's easier to focus and get those things done.
Okay. Thank you. You guys have given me some great ideas.
So I'm curious about the implementation of some of these concepts, how they have, how it works with some of these organizations, and where resistance might pop up, and how you deal with that resistance from doing business as usual, and that's just the way it's done. And what are some strategies for success in terms of changing an organizational philosophy or culture?
That's an excellent question. The question had to do with, in terms of the actual implementation within a me organization, how do you get people to change, and what about the resistance? It's particularly problematic in the public sector, where Pat and I were discussing earlier, where fragmentation to a certain extent intentional and even desirable, depending on the aim. And the aim of the founders, and it's trickled into every aspect, from national government agencies to separation of powers to state governments to school districts. Everyone talks about jurisdictions, right? And part of that is about breaking up power to prevent tyranny. So that was the aim, right? But it had the unintended consequence of doing this other thing, right? So we have to acknowledge that for some very noble reasons, right, a certain extent, to a large extent actually, this fragmentation and this lack of jurisdictional cooperation is intentional. But we also have to be realistic that we're in a global age, and things are much more interdependent, interconnected, in a way that they just haven't been there before. And part of that is about the learning process. So I'll give you an example. The county of Los Angeles is 9 million people. 1% of the population of the county works directly for the county. You think about that, 38 agencies. Okay? You want to talk about a labyrinth, you want to talk about, and Pat is sympathetic to what I'm talking about now, right? You can just imagine when you start trying to talk about bringing in, you can talk about quality, and you can talk about these things, but what does that actually mean in terms of talking about greater cooperation between these agencies? Everybody wants it, everyone talks about it, but what does it actually mean? Just on a very humble level, let me just say you can't force it. And you certainly can't force it into a system like that. But I'll just tell you a narrative in my own experience. We were running 30 MPA cohorts on site within County of Los Angeles, Ventura County, Santa Barbara County, and Riverside County. The majority of these were actually in LA County. And on top of that, we had students on the on-campus, which you can consider a control group, because that's like, a normal way of doing a thing. And I'm not advocating that our MPA does cohorts, because Pat and I ran this to ground over several days. We just realized the tracks won't work. But here was something that came out that we didn't anticipate. We would go into, for example, City of Glendale. We'd say we're going to run a cohort at Glendale Community College. We're going to invite Glendale city employees to that. What would end up happening is other county agencies, employees would say, you know what, that cohort that you're running in my agency is not working. Can I join the Glendale cohort? We say, sure, come on down. So we had LA Sheriff. We had LAPD. We even had Glendale PD. We would have firefighters and different agencies. These people would take a cohort of classes together for 2 years. Trust was built up in that cohort. They would talk about jurisdictional problems. And then we saw something really remarkable. There was empathy being built between these different separate agencies of these students. And so when we would give them problem-based learning exercises, we'd actually choose a real world wicked problem. They would use it as an exercise, but interesting what happened. They'd go back in their organization, they'd have a better understanding. they would then send their own employees going back and say, gotta go to the MBA program, go in there, and then they would come back trained again, same way. And they wouldn't necessarily go to Glendale, right, with their employees. They would maybe go to LASPD, School Police Department, because it was more convenient in the way the times were run. So the unintended consequence of this was actually remarkable, is that we saw the jurisdictional lines being torn down in some small way, sphere of influence, right, organically, right? So that's just one way. I don't think you can impose it.
Picking up and following, I would first make a distinction whether you're talking intra-organizational system or inter-organizational system. And I think particularly Bill and Ravi have given you a number of good examples, and there's a lot of writing about the problems on the intra-organizational. And they're tough enough, particularly, back to Michael's question to Bill about, is it more difficult in the public sector? And my argument would be yes, that the political pressures on the administrative system make a reorganization more difficult in a public government agency. When you go to the interorganizational, let me talk example again closer to home. If I say collective impact, are you Southern Utah people into it at all? No? United Ways across the country, with Salt Lakes being among the early leaders, realized in the early 2000s they had given multiple millions to multiple nonprofits, and they could show no noticeable change in anything important, poverty, illiteracy, anything, all right? They changed their entire mode despite practically being murdered by groups like the Boy Scouts that were accustomed to getting $500,000 a year from. Now what they require is a community to come together, and a community can be an incorporated town or it could be a geographic area. Identify a major problem, youth, what am I trying to say, not reading, what's my word, I missed it. Illiteracy, at a very young age, so forth. Every major public and nonprofit organization, and if need be for-profit, must sign into the partnership, and if they do, they get funding continually. They don't have to reapply every year. Okay. Now, with that comes all the assessment, the outcome measurement and things like that, which complicate things further. Because if, for example, let's say that South Salt Lake, which is one of the classic examples, is taking one on and not showing outcome success. Has it been a waste of time? A lot of people would say yes. Back to Ravi's point, what happens if they built social capital so that among agencies they know who they can trust? So the next time they go to work to solve an intractable problem, they have trust built up and they know who they can turn to and get things done. Now that's, I'm not just trying to sell you collective action. Collective impact, because there are a lot of problems with it in implementation. But that's a direct answer to your question in a very complex mode. And by the way, they're up into Summit County, I think, with some of the collective impact. It isn't just Salt Lake County.
I don't really have much to say except just something that came to my mind was just looking at isolated versus systemic problems and asking yourself, which one they are, and building up trust between those organizations is paramount. But, in my experience, it seems like like I said, it's this change of mindset of also creating the trust and being trustable. But then also, instead of looking for kind of the negative or saying, here's all the things going wrong, and looking for the Band-Aids, instead saying, okay, what is it we're wanting to accomplish? How does it involve this other agency? How can we involve everyone? Because you get more buy-in also. And if everyone's part of the solution, you're going to have a better outcome.
The only thing I would add is from just within looking at it from within specifically a department that you might be working in. And we've seen it in different organizations, nonprofits in particular, where, I mean, they really like the idea of a we versus me concept. And so they'll bring us in, but then the realization that, wait a second, we kind of like operating the way we're going. I mean, we're used to it. It's, we're heavily volunteer. This is how we've done it. And so we find that at that point, and Bill and I have talked a lot about it, is we can't push these kind of concepts out there. I mean, people are wired in a certain way, and we were talking about brain, I think you were talking about brain function and the way your brains function. I mean, we're brought up through this system to think a certain way for a long period of time. We've achieved where we are by doing business as usual. And now all of a sudden we're saying, we want you to flip your thinking 180 degrees and think of it as unusual. It doesn't happen. It's not natural for it. So you're going to get that pushback on it. So the way we look at it is, we wait till people pull us in. And it may only be a small number of people. Like one nonprofit we're working with, they've kind of pushed back on some things, but there's a couple of different departments that are interested in working with us. So we're going to work with them, again, going back to that sphere of influence idea, and see, even though they have imposed inputs into their system, which are going to make it harder for them to operate as a we element in the organization, we're going to try to work with them around those inputs. And then what our belief is, and what we've seen over and over, is they will be more effective. They will be more efficient. They will be more productive. And then we want them to see that, okay, let's not just do this in isolation. Can we start to have other people ask you the question, what are you doing? It's really amazing how you're thinking about things. And then that pulls more people into it. But pushing it, like almost everybody here has said, doesn't really work. I'm not sure that helps, but yeah.
Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind is first time I saw Akoff speak. Gosh, at the end of the day, one guy gets up and he says, Ross, he says, I just paraphrase, he says, I work in a me organization. Don't I have to wait until the organization becomes a we organization to take action? Something like that. I mean, very, very much like that. And Russ turns to him and says, you have to start where you are. And so it's so easy to wait until reinforcements arrive. But all that means is you just have to scope your effort. And so Russ would say, your responsibility is to take on the biggest system you can. So if you're a teacher, that means your classroom. It doesn't mean the elementary school, it means a classroom. But then you realize that as your efforts expand, in hindsight, when you include the others, you come up with a different solution. And you just have to realize that in hindsight, you'll always have a better answer. But if you wait for all the hindsight, you won't act. So you have to have the ability to do something within the scope. Understand that if you had others involved, to be a different solution. I think the big thing is not to alienate those. Try not to alienate people who aren't involved. They're just not ready. And the analogy we used at Rocketdyne was, not everybody gets on the train at the same time, but we have to be open to those who want to get on the train when they want to get on the train. And it can't be, the priest saying, we do have Mass 2 days. We have Mass every weekend, not just Easter and Sunday. That just alienates people. So you have to be open to those who aren't ready yet. And then realize, and then also realize that what you're doing may backfire for reasons you can't see, but you're still doing the best you know with what you have. And if you had that information, you'd regroup. So you just have to be willing to realize that it's possible there's other stuff out there, but you can't necessarily wait for all that information.
One thing that you had put up on your slide is a quote from my grandfather that the transformation begins with the individual. So you as an individual have begun that transformation, and you're going to be able, like we talked about, that sphere of influence. It may be in your family you're going to see it, but it will come out once you start to use this, whether it's in just your family to begin with, in your community, in your neighborhood, and you will start to see the power of it, the potential of it, and then that will carry into work and help bring people along, because I thought that was really important, and my grandfather said that constantly.
Two quick last things, but I would say just keep the train moving. It starts with the individual. But going back to even one of the things I also mentioned about fear, most of the time the pushback that you see is out of fear. And so I've tried, and it's hard, but a lot of times it's figuring out what is their fear and then helping them through that and giving them that confidence that, hey, even if this doesn't work the first time and even if there's failure, we're going to come back together and we're going to make this work. But that commitment being there, that trust being there is so important, but helping them get past the fears is so important.
Yeah.
We all know, heard of organizations that have gone, and I'm going to use the words from good to great, and backwards. Is there these concepts that we're learning and we're practicing, is there a possibility of self-perpetuation? If you get an organization to the point where it just, you're not there, but you're moving and you can leave as a leader in a leadership role. You can now go and do something somewhere else because the organization's going that direction or has gone that direction and it's safe. Can we build it to a point and then we're done and it keeps going? Or does it have to be something that's perpetually worked on all the time by those who understand the Deming principles and can help others?
I think it depends on how well people understand the model. This is where the theory comes in. I've seen people put in place exceptional business as unusual solutions that the organization interprets as a business as usual solution. And they think, well, you made the parts better. No, we made the relationships better. No, the parts. And they can't see the beauty of the solution. And the frustration there is that the learning, my challenge was, how do we get them to learn that it's a different solution? Because the organization's happy by the results. But my interest was, if their theory about the solution is based on a business as usual solution, then we miss the beauty of the solution. And so it was trying to educate those working on the solutions to do their best to refine the understanding of the solution. Because if you want to sustain the solution, you have to sustain the theory behind the solution. And there's one particular piece of hardware, very, very expensive piece of hardware, that was fabricated using relationships and not parts. And this was something no one ever thought was possible. So you talk about the 100% snap-fit pickup truck. And it was something like that, and the rocket engine. And so the folks who saw the solution were laughed at, but they were inspired, by things that made a lot of sense. And what's amazing is there's one big plate, which is made by a company in Minneapolis. It's $250,000, and in that plate go 1,000 tubes. Then they're joined together, and they all join in a snap-fit kind of way for 20 years. And my explanation as to why the solution has stayed for 20 years is because the explanation of how to do it was so powerful, and there's so much money being saved by doing it that way. And I'm willing to believe that people have come and gone, but they haven't lost track of how to do it. And I've seen other solutions come and go, and I think they come and go because the explanation they missed the explanation. And so the strategy, this is where the theory comes in. The better you understand the theory, the better you can build any bridge anywhere. And if you don't understand the theory, then all you're doing is copying bridges. But I've seen it really take root, and it's remarkable. But I think they have done it because they're making a ton of money doing it that way, and they're not going to forget. Because it just shattered them. And the awareness first of all didn't believe it was possible. They then adopted it, and then got to the point of not sharing exactly. I mean, we knew conceptually what they were doing, but they wouldn't reveal the details. And I said, great, they own it. And that's just not going to go away. But Ravi mentioned Gypsy Rennie, and she put in place a major solution, which I can talk about, and it had to do with work she did at Cadillac. And it was likewise a solution of minding gaps instead of banging things together. And she said the solution was probably the proudest thing she ever contributed to in her 4 or 5 years with GM. So I said, now, tell me now that that is the way GM does that across Cadillac. She says, well, Bill. And I said, tell me that's the way it happens all across General Motors. She says, well. And I said, I don't feel that bad. And so this is why, but I think the issue is that the solutions are implemented by people who understood the theory, but the theory didn't permeate the organization. Because these are not people that would throw away money. So I think the reason they threw away the solution is they missed the essence of the solution. And hopefully, that's what I was trying to bring out today. The difference between gaps and parts is night and day. Night and day.
The one thing I would say is, when you say, does the organization ever get to an end? I mean, that you've accomplished, am I saying that right? The culture. I would offer that no, it doesn't, because that would assume that everything around the organization has stayed the same. Okay? And if you're in any kind of organization, your inputs, the boundaries of that system, your outcomes, whether desirable or undesirable, are going to change. So things around that. Now, if you were in a bubble where all of that stayed static, then yes, you could in theory say you'll get there, but that's never going to happen. You're always going to have new people coming into the system. You're always going to have new pressures on it, new regulations, new imposed things. So looking at it from my grandfather's perspective, your original theory is going to change because of new knowledge. And then you have to revise that theory to keep it going. And I believe what happens with a lot of these companies that start off like rocket ships and then all of a sudden flatline, and you look at them and you say, well, what happened to this organization? Is because they thought they got to where they were. And they started to build all of these elements into the organization that creates the fear, that which leads to a lack of creativity. All these things end up snowballing, and next thing you know, they're not as relevant as they used to be. But that's what I believe is really, really key, is taking that new knowledge that you have gained, developing that theory, and realizing it never stops. If it does stop, there's something that's highly, highly unusual.
And just with a global economy now, we have such extreme disruption happening so quickly and changes happening so fast within the workplace that if we are insular at all, and it's kind of like the people, hey, I'm number one, and then they find out 5 years later, wait, I'm not number one anymore, I think and we've seen that in certain books. I even just read Good to Great last year again, and, there are certain companies that it was like, well, wait, now they're bankrupt. So what happened? And so it almost needs to be another book, right? But that's the point, is that I think sometimes we can get focused on that. And if there's not that humility or paying attention to what's going on around, it's really easy to become pretty insular and start saying, within your own sounding walls, hey, we're so great and we've achieved so much. But if you're not paying attention to what's happening around, you're going to fall really fast, and it's going to be a free fall.
First, real echo of both Eric and Heather. As soon as you think you're there, you failed. That would be my first. It's a never-ending process, never-ending. The other thing, back to the other part of your question, when can a person move on? I would make this: if the philosophy is dependent on having any one person there, you failed. In other words, if the management philosophy has really been integrated into the organization, then your people will move on. And you will, in fact, that could be a healthy step when people leave.
Let's do one more question. I was neglectful. You had a question.
Yeah, so in a lot of public organizations, there are always a lot of imposed restrictions. How can you still maintain that kind of we organization of having all those imposed restrictions coming in on you?
You're going to repeat it?
Yeah, so the question is, there are these restrictions that are built into the me type organizations. And so how can you overcome those restrictions if you're trying to create a we sort of environment? Is that the essence of the question?
No, it's how can you still have the we environment when you can't do anything about imposed restrictions,
Okay.
especially in the public sector?
Okay. So there are these imposed restrictions that are embedded in the structure. How can you have a we attitude? How can you implement a we culture within those very rigid and well-defined and well-embedded restrictions? That's excellent.
I just thought of an example that I had when I was serving on a board. We just kept getting more restrictions every single year. And finally, one day we just said, we need to go through this and actually see what is lawful and looking at those things that must be done a certain way or must be spelled out, maybe federal, state law, or whatever it might be, and looking at, what are suggestions, and even dividing up. I ended up dividing up our policy and procedure book because a lot of times people integrate them as one, so the policies and procedures, which is really dangerous, even lawfully. So we ended up taking out and just streamlining things and saying, okay, what policies are must-have policies? Have those. Then have a different guidelines or procedures or maybe best, kind of suggestions, best practices book, whatever it might be. But really looking at those, because the tendency in any organization and any system is to add and not subtract. And so a lot of times we need to really look at that and say, okay, what can be done here? What can be streamlined?
I don't know how to be candidly answer your question without sounding fatalistic. But that's not my purpose. Deming said, the answer to your question is you need to change the structure. This is obvious, right? But he also said that the organizations and the organizational structures that are in most need of reform are the least capacity ones to be able to affect it. So it's a catch-22. Okay, that's the fatalistic side. Now here's the hope side. Sometimes exogenous events shatter bad systems. Usually through the accretion of anomalies, you get a paradigm shift, and they may not necessarily be leadership driven. Okay, but you could have someone like an FDR, for example, who didn't cause the shattering, right? Didn't cause the exogenous events, but is able to see that, build a consensus, and you get a restructuring of the thing. Now, whether you agree of that system was a desirable one or not, but it was a fundamentally restructuring of American capitalism. And it did create the largest and most stable middle class in human history. And it wasn't just in this country. Other leaders did the same in other industrial countries, including elsewhere. And it was based on a system of ideas, right? The thing is, someone said the success is the combination of leadership readiness and then opportunity or challenges. And the difference is leaders that are able to understand the difference. Which ones are problems and which ones are opportunities. My good friend Mark Blythe writes about crises, and he talks about wars and crises and so on being constructed, right? And in a in a conference I went to, he wrote the book Austerity, which was picked up by Larry Summers. Larry Summers ended up writing a full-page NFT review on it. But Mark Blythe talks about how the financial crisis and all this was basically a failure of leadership and so on and so forth. But I'll never forget what he said. He said in one conference I went to, he said, in his really stark Scottish accent, he said, "How do you know when you have a crisis?" Right? If a Mack truck comes barreling through your living room while you're watching telly, that's not a crisis. That's a blooming disaster.
You do that well.
Well, yeah, but I mean, what's the difference between a recession and a depression? Right? Someone has to be aware and be able to communicate that this is an issue. 3/4 of slow growth, the Fed steps in, says this is a recession. Okay? That's something that we've constructed. Right? And then that's something that we have accepted. Market failures prior to Keynesian economics, prior to 1930s, was a condition. It wasn't a crisis. This is a normal market fluctuation. And the fact that the country lost 40% of its value overnight, that was just the market. This is a natural, it'll correct itself. Right? Someone had to say that this is a crisis. This is not just a condition. A condition is something you have no control over. It's not a problem because you can't, if for example, a meteor is heading straight to the earth and you can see it and you can measure it, fine, but there's nothing you can do about it. That's not a crisis or a problem. That's a condition. And therefore, because there's no solution, there's no moral imperative to do anything about it. Right? These things come about when we recognize that this is something that is a problem. This is something that, at least theoretically, we can do something about. There has to be a certain element of the problem being tractable. I mean, it can't be intractable. You have to be able to see it, be able to call attention to it. And then there has to be, at least theoretically, something we can do about it. But we need to be able to identify it. And that's the key piece. Sometimes it's just a matter of convincing people that this is something that is not something we have to accept under the status quo. Right? And it's through that where people begin to change minds, and then they can change structural systems, and that's what happened. And
I happen to know that the questioner works in the state system for people with intellectual challenges, in which 95% of your revenue comes from state government? At least 80. And talk about a micromanaged system. Excuse me, no.
Yes. I'm not offended.
Yeah, it is much the same as mental health,
Yes.
and most of the human services in the state, in which the number of input and activities are mandated and are not negotiable. Make a reorganization first very, very difficult to implement. But then I would go back really to Eric's comments about your sphere of influence and what you can and cannot influence. You do have room to do some innovation. You have to influence the people above you that those are in the best interests of clients and of your organization. You also have to be influencing, in my opinion, the people at the top of your organization, that they have to be ready to use political power against the state to not add regulations coming down from the feds. That takes courage, but that's systems thinking. In other words, you're no longer thinking about your organization and just the people you serve. You're thinking about the whole. So I think, the mental health system several years ago, a state association effectively threatened to strike. And the state has no delivery capability anymore, just like it doesn't in your field. At that point, they got the state representatives in their field to sit down and talk about what restrictions, what rules could be bent without harming things. But it took courage, and you had to have a number of your providers doing it, or the state would have whipsawed you and really hurt you. So again, it's a long way of saying it takes a lot of political courage to do it in the place you're in. But on the other hand, I think you have a moral obligation to try.
One last thought on that, because that's right about the political observations. And if I could give everyone just a piece of advice about politics, like I said, if you would have told me years ago that I would even be involved in politics, I would have just probably laughed. I actually come from a political family on the far left, and here we're kind of on the right. And so anyway, I don't know how it all came together, but anyway, one of the things that I really would stress to all of you is know who your elected officials, first of all, are. And if you don't, find out. There's a way you can go on to, it's a utah.gov, a website. You just plug in kind of your address, find out who your representatives are. I was at a refugee providers meeting just a little while ago, about a few months ago. United Way was there. We had different services. All of them provide services to refugees. There was not one politician in the room. And when I asked the organizers, and I said, who have you invited to this meeting? Have you ever invited? And I listed off a few names, and I work with all of them. I know them all very well. Then they're good people. And they said, no, we've never invited them. And that is part of the problem, because if you do not invite them to the table, we kind of have this saying in politics that if you're not sitting at the table looking at the menu, you're going to be served. You know, you're going to get what you're going to get, okay? And so a lot of times the legislators, they just don't know the unintended consequences of some of these bills. Sometimes they're just not aware. They think, oh, this might be a good thing, and they vote on it. So you have to know that. And I would just really encourage you, especially with, you know, right now, kind of the political climate. I can tell you, I've worked with people on the left, on the right. I work with all of them. And we have good people involved in government. We live in a state with good people. Never assume that they're villains. A lot of times they just don't know. It's what they don't know. And they're not going to know unless someone tells them. And so you've got to invite them to the table. And you've got to talk to them about some of the issues and encourage even your supervisors and saying, hey, you know, have we talked to President of the Senate about this? Have we talked to the Speaker of the House? You'd be very surprised at their responsiveness. And I've worked with legislation. I do it almost every year. And this year, I was for some legislation and against some legislation. And a lot of them heard from me. And I said, here's what it's about. And I got prompt email responses back. And so never underestimate your power and your sphere of influence. But like I said, don't go into a situation trying to make it adversarial right off, because a lot of times they just don't know and they haven't been invited into the conversation. And when you can actually say, come into our world, you're invited, and I want you to see what this means or what this piece of state code means, they're like, wow, I had no idea. And so just, you know, like I said, if you learn nothing else today, just know who represents you and be in contact with them. And you'd be surprised. That's actually what I tell people all the time. They're like, how did you get to be the governor's, you know, deputy campaign manager? And I said, you know what? I showed up. I showed up to an event, which led to another event. I volunteered. I became involved. And then next thing I knew, I was, you know, working for the governor. And like I said, it was not planned. It wasn't something that I'd tried to do, but be involved. And if you're not involved, you're going to have the actions of others affect you for a long time if you're not active.
The only thing I would add to that is these folks understand that world far better than I do. And I think that is phenomenal advice along those lines. And I think if you use the Deming philosophy, the whole PDSA cycle, what's your theory? Okay, so when you're actually talking to these folks and you're talking to the politicians and you're engaging them on what's going on, it's not a, quote, bitch session, but it's, we have a theory that if we did it this way, this would be a prediction of results. And again, what I would also encourage is, if I was a politician and you're proposing something, when it comes to the area that you're working in, any change like that would frighten me because it could have a real negative impact, right? So what I would offer is, don't boil the ocean to begin with. Start with a thimble or a cup with an idea to show them that you're thinking about this. Here's our theory. Here's our prediction of results. Here, you're not coming to them to make things worse, right? You would be coming to them to make an improvement, to improve the services that you're offering, and to show them why you think this one small change or this one small idea could make a difference, and then let them see that that works, because then you can build on that capital you've developed, and you haven't put the politician or the other person at such a high risk to begin with, but you're taking them down that road, and then you're engaging them and bringing them into this thinking.
By the way, could I just expand that?
Yeah.
Not just politicians, but agency people.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
not just elected.
Yeah.
Can I just add a point to that, what you were saying, Heather, was so good. I'm an elected official from Summit County, and I see we have a lot of
Michael?
districts and, sorry. Anyway, I'm an elected official from Summit County, and I see a lot of our local area districts and boards and that need people to serve on them. And we're chronically short-staffed in trying to solicit members from the community to get involved. And as I've sat here and listened to this today, I mean, I have some ability to, in fact, affect policy in the county, but I can see in smaller organizations, smaller districts, getting involved, you can take some of these ideas, and it's a risk-free idea for a politician to appoint you onto that board, because you then have some ability to get involved and direct policy a little bit, help establish that organization, and create kind of a, I hate to use this term, but a safe space for the politician to see this really does work, and then they might incorporate some of those ideas into the greater county. Just my 2 cents.
And now sadly, I have to bring the Q&A portion to a close so that I can introduce Pat Keeley in just a moment. Before I do, I'd like to thank Steve, I'd like to thank Heather, I'd like to thank Kevin, I'd like to thank Bill. I would also very much like to extend great thank you to Monica and to Gail, and for the wonderful, and to also to Lee, the cameraman, who's done an outstanding job, drove all the way up here, and to all of you for your participation and for the great questions. Really thank you for making this the great success that I think that it is, and I'm just overwhelmed with the attendance and all the participation. Pat Keeley is the inaugural director of the MPA program that began in 2008.
Yes.
First cohort, and Gail was a part. Gail came later, but Heather and Gail are proud members. Are
And a former director of the U of U.
and that is true. I had to get that one in.
That's right.
She was my pathfinder.
But Pat has been very engaged, along with Janet Borg, in building the scholarship, which we've named after her. She initiated it, along with Gail and Heather, and doing great work with that. But should have known, Pat, you weren't going to stay away, right? And we don't want you to stay away. We're glad, and now you're very much involved with community engagement and with a very innovative study abroad program called Community on the Go. So why don't you share?
Well, thank you, but I want to jump back to the 80s, some of you may have lived through those, and thank you. I was very honored to be mentored by an industrial engineer, and he introduced me to the true Deming concepts and systems. And I say that because I also lived through several untruths where people tried to reinvent government at the federal level and didn't do so well. There were many challenges. I actually did some work with Allied Signal, with Six Sigma, and quality circles, presidential awards, and so forth. So fast forward a couple of decades, and I meet Steve Ott and later Ravi Roy, and in the course of conversations, you hear the word Deming, and immediately you go, oh, I know I can talk about systems, and I can communicate and share these ideas without hesitation, and they'll get it. And I want to say to you, use that word in your conversations, because you might find more people out there who go, oh, Deming, yeah. And the image that we used many years ago, still is relevant, is the old pebble in the water. You have a calm body of water, you drop a pebble in, and there are these concentric circles. And I feel like we need to support each other in this. We talk about all the challenges. In government, I think it's 10 times more challenging to implement these concepts, and you talked about it as well. So we need to support each other, and when we get stuck or frustrated, we need to say, Deming. That's our secret word now, and it shouldn't be secret. It really shouldn't. Okay, so then, you creep along, you meet people, and they get systems, and some people get this naturally. So I meet Gail and I meet Heather, and we start talking about, what could we do to transfer this travel opportunity for students into the community. And, we're brainstorming, and of course, what are we up against? Well, the organization of Southern Utah University, which I love, okay? And the University of Utah I love too. They're red, so it sort of goes together. But, good point. So, but now I'm going to do I'm going to do a pivot. That's the word these days, isn't it? A pivot. And you all probably know the name Alfred Hitchcock, right? Great director. And if you know one of his movies, North by Northwest, Cary Grant was being interviewed about working with Alfred Hitchcock. And Hitchcock was known to be a real pain in the butt as a director. And they were saying, well, Cary Grant, do you like working with him? You've done a couple of movies, and we hear he's really, really controlling and very strict about all of the different scenes. So if you've seen the movie, there's a scene where this plane is flying over, and he's running and hiding and ducking. And they asked him about this scene. And Cary Grant said, well, you know what? He actually stimulates creativity because he puts controls. He puts us in this box, and this is what he says to his movie stars. You are in this box, and within that box, you can be as creative as you'd like. And I feel like that's sort of where we are in an organization in the public sector. We have to be super creative to stay in our boxes because we respect the government and the whole process, but we still have to be creative. Okay, so along comes Gail and Heather and I, and we are mentored or supported by a dean, Patrick Clark, and he says, go forth and do whatever you three want to do when it comes to creating this program. So we're in a box, but what do we start doing? Well, first we're going to capture alumni affairs and community relations. Wasn't easy, but we sort of got them on. And then we've got international relations, and they sort of came along. And now, we've got this coalition group going, and we are reaching out to community members, lifelong learning, and being connected to people who are interested or graduated from SUU, and we're going to take them places they want to go. It's faculty-led. Anybody can go, but it's faculty-led, so you get this incredible experience in traveling with us. And we're building relationships. We're working the system and creating a systems environment within SUU, and we're really achieving some great things. And we're going to, where are we going? To Normandy, Operation Overlord, Christmas in London, Morocco, Machu Picchu. So I have more information about our trips and our travel. But the point here is that we can work together and we can make that changes. And the secret word is Deming.